Welcome to the Bill Sang Podcast. My name is Bill Sang, and I've been doing this little series on sort of the creepier things of the Bible, sort of the scarier things, and there is absolutely a root to everything that we find in our world today that we consider to be creepy, whether it's giants, whether it's aliens, whether it's Bigfoot, whether it's sea monsters, no matter what it is, ghosts, demons, you name it. Everything finds its roots and can be explained by a proper understanding of the biblical narrative, starting in the book of Genesis. And that's really where we started our study already. And I've been doing very short episodes in relation to this because I don't want to go overboard on it. But on the same token, I want to kind of build on each point. And last time we talked about the fall of mankind, Satan's involvement in that, and the possibility that the serpent was a dragon, but that the dragon was actually what we would call a seraph, perhaps, which is an angelic being. And ancient sources oftentimes, or ancient artwork, oftentimes portrayed seraphs as being serpentine in nature. So it would have been sort of an ethereal dragon in some respects. That was their natural form. And some people have hypothesized that. Maybe, I don't know. But nonetheless, I am going to go down the rabbit trail today a little bit and talk about dragons as it relates to the Bible. And I'm actually starting there with the term dragons itself. I personally believe that dragons existed, maybe to some degree still exist today even. And where I'm starting, once again, with that is in the book of Genesis, not after Genesis 3. That's where we read about the serpent, the fall of mankind, but prior to Genesis 3 in Genesis chapter 1. It talks about God creating the great creatures of the sea, the great sea monsters, which the word for that in Hebrew is actually tanin or taninim, which is the plural, which means dragons or monsters in that regard. And this might be referring to whales and such, but we do know that in fact that there were dragon-like sea monsters that once existed in the seas. That you can think of things like plesiosaurs and mosasaurs and liopleurodons and ichthyosaurs and creatures along those lines. They would have fallen under the category of this thing that we call a sea dragon. And it's very fascinating because ancient literature oftentimes talks about even more mysterious sea creatures, one of them being Leviathan. Leviathan is mentioned in the Bible. I believe the Bible gives an accurate description of what Leviathan was. But I'm not going to go too much into Leviathan because Leviathan actually, Leviathan has a couple of different possibilities. Being a multi-headed dragon of pure mythology, of being possibly a spiritual reality that maybe tormented people, or being a giant reptilian sea creature that may have breathed fire. People have other possibilities. I think one of the less likely things would be a crocodile. As we look in the book of Job, that some people say, oh, well, what is describing the book of Job about Leviathan is actually a crocodile. I don't personally believe that. I believe there's absolutely something more going on with Leviathan, that it is a created creature, whether it is fantastical or if it's natural. So we have the roots of dragons laid down in the book of Genesis. And throughout the Bible, dragons are actually mentioned. Now, our modern translations have kind of corrupted the word tanin and taninim to conflate it with a similar word. I think it's just tan, which means jackal, which is kind of a wild dog. And so lots of modern translations replaces. When you see the word jackal in your Bibles today, in modern translations, lots of times when you come across that word jackal, that is actually the word for dragon. So that's something that's very interesting. Now, as it relates to real creatures, yes, I believe that dragons are real creatures. I think that dinosaurs were what we would call dragons back then. And as creationists oftentimes say, that dragons or dinosaurs, the name wasn't invented till like the 1800s, but the Bible was written long before that. So why aren't dinosaurs mentioned in the Bible? Well, the word for dinosaurs wasn't in existence yet. The word dinosaur did not exist yet. Instead, we refer to them as different things, but on top of that, we look at it in terms of different languages too. A dragon is merely a terrible lizard. Dinosaur means terrible lizard, and Tannin or Taninin is categorized as a category of terrible lizard, and it can be either a creature of the sea or it can be a creature on land. And as I mentioned, that the word for serpent, nachash, can also be synonymous or at least associated with seraphs. And so it's possible there's two different classes of dragons that we're looking at in terms of the Bible. Potentially the literal, or not literal, but rather the physical creature of a dragon that we see in the form of things like the dinosaurs and in forms of like sea creatures and even some of the flying serpents that we hear about. And then on top of that, we also have things like crocodiles and Komodo dragons, things like that. But then also, the other category would perhaps be that of a spiritual dragon, along the lines of like a seraph, and perhaps some of the dragons that knights and such faced back in the day, they might have been of a more spiritual nature. Now, this opens up a whole can of discussion that I'm not entirely familiar, that I don't even know exactly how to explain it. But I see this a lot in terms of talking about the weird phenomena of our day and looking back at what the Bible has to say, is that lots of times you see a physical reality, but you also see a spiritual reality as well that are very closely linked. And something I'd like to get into eventually is perhaps even the idea of Bigfoot and the Nephilim, as well as spiritual entities as well. So I want to talk more about these topics in the future, but for right now, we're going to leave it at that. That there are very well maybe two classes of dragons, the dragons that are physical and the dragons that are spiritual, and that there's some sort of relationship between the two, but at the same time, they're also vastly, vastly different. As we know that the physical dinosaurs, we can see fossils of them, so we know they're capable of dying. While the spiritual dragons, the angelic dragons, the seraphs perhaps, are not able to die in the same manner. So I hope that this was something that was fascinating. It was a very, very short take on it, not a deep dive per se, but I appreciate you joining me for this episode of the Bill Sang Podcast. I'll be more to talk about these things throughout this week and throughout this month, and I just ask now that you be blessed.